The convent stood on the edge of the hills, where olive trees leaned toward the earth as if listening to secrets buried in the soil. For decades, nothing truly changed there. The days followed the same gentle rhythm: prayer at dawn, work in silence, teaching children who arrived barefoot and left smiling, tending the sick who had nowhere else to go. The stone walls were old, but they felt safe, as if they had absorbed centuries of faith and could protect anyone who lived within them. The bells were the heart of that place. When they rang, the valley listened. When they rang, the sisters believed the world was still ordered, still meaningful. The first sign that this order was breaking came quietly. Travelers stopped coming. Merchants avoided the road. Letters from nearby towns arrived late, then not at all. When refugees finally appeared, they did not knock on the gate with hope. They collapsed against it with desperation. Their clothes were torn, their faces hollow, their voices shaking as if even speaking might bring punishment. They told stories in fragments, of banners raised where crosses once stood, of new rulers who spoke calmly while dismantling everything familiar, of churches converted into warehouses, schools emptied, priests silenced. The sisters listened, exchanging worried glances, but they continued their work. Fear was something they had been taught to face with prayer, not panic. At night, they prayed longer than usual. Not for victory or miracles, but for strength. They believed that their lives of service would shield them. They owned nothing. They threatened no one. Surely they would be spared. After all, they were women who healed, taught, and fed the hungry. Who would see danger in that? The morning the riders came, the air felt strangely still. No birds sang. Even the olive trees seemed frozen. The sound of hooves echoed against the stone long before the men themselves appeared. The gate opened slowly. An officer read from a paper, his voice measured, almost bored. The land was being reassigned. The convent was now under new authority. There would be changes. No one raised a sword. No one shouted. That calmness was more frightening than violence. The sisters were gathered in the courtyard and counted like objects. Their names were written down carefully, as if accuracy could soften what was coming. They were told they would be relocated, for their own protection. Protection was a word that sounded kind but felt empty. When one sister asked if they could stay together, the officer did not answer. He simply folded the paper and signaled to his men. The bells never rang again. That evening, the sisters packed what little they owned. A book here, a rosary there. Some left personal items behind, convinced they would return. Others clutched small keepsakes as if they were lifelines. They ate their last meal together in silence, the scrape of spoons louder than any conversation. No one cried openly. Tears felt dangerous, as if showing grief too early might weaken them for what lay ahead. As they were led away at dawn, the convent shrank behind them, stone by stone, until it was nothing more than a memory. The road split again, and with each turn, groups of sisters were separated. No explanations were given. No goodbyes allowed. A hand released another hand, and just like that, a lifetime of shared prayer was broken. Some were taken to cities they had never heard of. Others were delivered to villages where they were strangers, watched with suspicion. Their habits were removed. Their hair was covered differently. Their names were replaced with ones that felt foreign in their mouths. They were told these changes were small, temporary, necessary. But each change cut deeper than the last. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. They worked long hours doing tasks meant to exhaust rather than fulfill. Silence was enforced, but not the peaceful silence of prayer, this was the silence of erasure. They were forbidden to speak of their past. When one sister accidentally mentioned the convent, she was punished not harshly, but publicly, so others would learn to swallow their memories. The cruelty was not loud. It did not rely on whips or blood. It relied on time. On repetition. On the slow pressure of being told, every day, that who you were no longer mattered. That your faith was foolish. That your history was a mistake. Death, at least, would have honored what they had been. This existence denied it. At night, alone on thin mats or cold floors, the sisters fought battles no one could see. They tried to remember hymns but forgot verses. They tried to picture the chapel but lost details. Faces blurred. Voices faded. Forgetting felt like betrayal, but remembering hurt too much. Some prayed silently, terrified of being overheard. Others stopped praying altogether, not because they stopped believing, but because belief had become too painful to carry. And yet, in the deepest part of their suffering, a quiet resistance began to grow. Not rebellion with weapons or words, but something smaller and harder to destroy. A look of recognition passed between two women across a crowded room. A shared memory flickered in their eyes. A piece of bread was broken and handed over without a word. In these moments, they felt human again. They learned that what was being done to them was not meant to end their lives. It was meant to stretch them thin, to hollow them out, to leave behind bodies that obeyed without souls that resisted. That was what made it worse than death. Death would have been an ending. This was a long, deliberate unmaking. Still, something inside them refused to disappear. Even as their world collapsed, even as their identities were stripped away layer by layer, a quiet truth remained. They had loved. They had served. They had believed. And no matter how hard the world tried to erase that, it lived on, fragile, wounded, but unbroken, waiting for a moment, however small, to be remembered. Time did not move forward anymore. It stretched outward, thin and merciless, turning each day into a mirror of the last. Morning arrived not with purpose but with obligation. The sisters rose because they were told to rise, worked because they were told to work, slept because exhaustion left them no choice. The world had reduced them to motion without meaning. Even pain became ordinary, and that ordinariness was its own form of terror. Some were placed in homes where they were watched constantly. Their silence was interpreted as obedience, but inside, their thoughts screamed. They learned to control their faces, to keep their eyes lowered, to make themselves invisible. A wrong look could invite suspicion, and suspicion could lead to disappearance. They never learned where the disappeared went. Not knowing was intentional. Fear grows best when it has no clear shape. Others labored in crowded workshops where the air was thick with dust and despair. They stitched and carried and cleaned until their hands cracked and bled. When they slowed, they were mocked for weakness. When they endured, they were told it proved they were meant for nothing else. The message was always the same: you are less than you were, and you will never be more again. Language itself became an enemy. Speaking their mother tongue brought punishment, so words retreated inward. Thoughts began to form in broken phrases, memories losing their edges. Some sisters panicked when they realized they could no longer recall simple prayers without effort. Faith had once flowed naturally, like breath. Now it had to be forced, hidden, protected like a forbidden object. What hurt most was not the loss of comfort, but the loss of witness. In the convent, suffering had been shared. Pain was spoken, held, answered with prayer and touch. Here, suffering was isolated. Each sister believed she was alone in her despair, unaware that others nearby were carrying the same invisible weight. Isolation was the sharpest blade of all. There were moments when death seemed merciful. When illness came, some did not fight it. They lay still, eyes closed, hoping the end would take them quietly. But often, even that release was denied. Bodies survived even when spirits begged not to. Survival without dignity became its own sentence. And yet, the human heart is stubborn. It clings even when it has no reason to. In stolen moments, resistance found strange shapes. A sister would rearrange stones into a small cross and then scatter them before anyone noticed. Another would trace sacred words onto the dirt with her toe, erasing them as soon as they were written. These acts changed nothing outwardly, but inwardly they were lifelines. Sometimes, they recognized each other without words. A glance held too long. A rhythm hummed too softly to be heard but familiar enough to awaken memory. In those moments, the past rushed back with painful clarity, the smell of candle wax, the echo of footsteps in stone corridors, the warmth of shared meals. The pain of remembering was sharp, but it proved they were still themselves. Years passed, marked not by calendars but by loss. Hair grayed. Backs bent. Eyes dulled. Some sisters adapted so well that even they wondered if the past had been real. That frightened them more than punishment ever had. To forget willingly felt like surrender. Those who still remembered carried a quiet grief. They mourned not only what had been taken, but what history would never know. There would be no records of their kindness, no acknowledgement of their suffering. Their lives would dissolve into silence, as if they had never mattered. The world would move on, clean and unbothered, while their stories faded into dust. But meaning does not require recognition. This truth revealed itself slowly. Even stripped of everything, they still chose how to treat one another. They chose gentleness when cruelty would have been easier. They chose restraint when bitterness tempted them. In a system designed to erase compassion, every small act of mercy became an act of defiance. One sister, older than the rest, began caring for the sick quietly, using scraps of knowledge she had once taught openly. She could not heal everyone, but she listened. She sat beside those who were dying and held their hands, whispering words no one else could hear. When she was asked why she bothered, she simply said it was who she had always been. No one punished her for that. Perhaps they did not understand how dangerous it was to let humanity survive. The terror they endured was never just physical. It was existential. It asked a cruel question again and again: if everything that defined you is taken away, do you still exist? Their answer was not spoken, but lived. Yes, quietly. Yes, painfully. Yes, even when the cost was unbearable. This was why it was worse than death. Death would have closed the story. What they endured forced them to keep living inside a story they were not allowed to tell, carrying faith like a hidden wound, memory like a forbidden language. And still, somehow, they endured, not because they were unbreakable, but because even broken things can refuse to disappear. As the years dragged on, the sisters learned that time itself could become an instrument of punishment. Days blended together until memory struggled to separate one from another. Without seasons marked by celebration or ritual, life lost its shape. They measured existence by endurance alone. Waking meant continuing. Sleeping meant temporary escape. Dreams, when they came, were cruel reminders of what had been stolen, bells ringing, children laughing, hands joined in prayer. Waking from those dreams felt like losing everything all over again. The world around them continued with unsettling normalcy. Markets bustled. Children grew. New buildings rose where familiar ones had fallen. This ordinary motion made their suffering feel invisible, almost imaginary. Pain that is unseen can make the sufferer doubt its own reality. Some sisters wondered if they were being punished for something they could not remember. Guilt crept in where injustice should have been named. That confusion was not accidental. When cruelty convinces its victims to blame themselves, it tightens its grip. They were constantly told that their former lives had been foolish, unnecessary, even shameful. The repetition of that message wore down certainty. A sister might wake one morning unable to remember why she had ever chosen that life at all. The loss of purpose frightened her more than hunger or cold. Purpose had once carried her through long nights and harder days. Without it, even breathing felt heavy. The body adapts faster than the soul. Muscles hardened. Skin toughened. The sisters learned how to conserve energy, how to avoid notice, how to survive with less. But the soul resisted adaptation. It rebelled in quiet ways, unexpected tears, sudden anger, an ache that had no physical source. Some grew withdrawn, speaking only when forced. Others became overly compliant, hoping obedience might buy safety. Each response was a strategy for survival, not a reflection of weakness. Occasionally, someone new arrived. A woman brought from another place, eyes wide with shock, still carrying the posture of someone who believed rescue was possible. The older sisters recognized that look immediately. They did not correct her. Hope, even false hope, deserved a gentle death. Instead, they offered what comfort they could, small and careful. They had learned that the most dangerous thing was not despair, but being seen offering too much kindness. There were nights when one sister would quietly begin to cry, the sound muffled by fabric or hands. Another would shift closer, pretending to sleep, offering presence without risk. In those